The stone was cold before the cold had a name for itself. That is the first thing you would notice. Not the darkness, not the silence, not the particular smell of a medieval castle at 4 in the morning, which was equal parts damp wall, old ash, and the faint sweetness of hay that had been walked on by too many boots. No, the first thing would be the cold of the floor beneath your feet, a cold so immediate and so thorough that it would travel straight up through the soles and into your chest before you had taken a single step. Thomas was 13 years old, and he had not slept well. He never slept well. The pallet he shared with 2 other boys in the lower servantry was narrow, and the straw inside it had gone flat months ago, compressed by the accumulated weight of exhausted young bodies who fell into it each night like stones dropped into shallow water. He had perhaps 4 hours of something that resembled sleep. The rest was a kind of grey hovering, not wakefulness, not rest, but the particular suspension of a body too tired to be awake and too cold to go deeper. Go ahead and pull your blanket a little closer now. You are going to want to feel the warmth of where you are, because where Thomas is, there is none. He was on his feet before the bell rang. You learned quickly, in a castle, that the bell was not a kindness, it was a warning that you were already behind. The head porter, a broad-shouldered man named Gerald, who communicated almost entirely through the angle of his eyebrows, had made this clear to Thomas on his very first morning, 6 months earlier. Gerald had not shouted. He had simply looked at Thomas, who had arrived at the bell rather than before it, and said quietly that a servant who waited to be summoned was a servant who was already failing. That single sentence had rearranged something in Thomas's understanding of what his life was now. The day's first task was water, always water. The great wooden buckets had to be filled from the well in the inner courtyard and carried to the kitchens before the cook, a formidable woman everyone called Marta, though that may not have been her name, began her work. Marta's work began, as far as anyone could determine, at approximately the same time that darkness did. She was always already there, already moving, already in possession of opinions about the temperature of everything. Thomas carried the first bucket in both hands, the rope handle biting into his palms in the way that it always bit, in the exact same place it had bitten yesterday and the day before, building a set of calluses that were really just the shape of his duties made visible in skin. The courtyard was blue-black and breathlessly still. Somewhere above the eastern wall, the sky was considering the idea of becoming a slightly different shade of dark. Not dawn yet, not even the suggestion of it. Just the castle and the cold and the boy and the water, and the day, vast and indifferent, had only just begun. There was a word used in medieval households that has mostly vanished from modern language, and the word was degree. Not degree as in temperature, not degree as in education, but degree as in your precise and unalterable position within the living architecture of the world. Every person in a castle had a degree. It was invisible, and it was absolute, and it governed everything: what door you entered through, which part of the hall you stood in, whether you were permitted to sit, whether you were permitted to sit, whether you were permitted to speak, whether you existed in any meaningful social sense at all. Thomas was at the bottom of this architecture. Not the very bottom, there were scullery boys younger than him who occupied that particular darkness, but close enough that the bottom was always visible from where he stood, like a drain in the centre of a floor you were always being pushed toward. Above Thomas were the senior kitchen servants. Above them were the household officers, the steward, who managed the entire domestic operation of the castle with the focused intensity of a man who had made organization into a kind of religion, the marshal, who controlled the stables and the outer yards, the chamberlain, who governed access to the lord's private rooms with the careful jealousy of a man who understood that proximity to power was itself a form of power. Above all of them was the Lord, whose name was spoken differently by different people, with reverence by some, with fear by others, with the particular careful neutrality of those who had learned that having feelings about the powerful was an indulgence they could not afford. You would not have understood this hierarchy on your first day. You would have felt it the way you feel a current in water before you understand which direction it is moving. It lived in the way people did not make eye contact with those above them, in the speed at which a body arranged itself into deference when a senior figure entered the room, in the small territorial choreography of who moved aside for whom in a narrow corridor. Settle into this thought for a moment, because it matters. Thomas had never been taught the rules. He had absorbed them. The way you absorb language as a very small child, not through instruction, but through immersion, through consequence, through the gradual accumulation of 1,000 small signals that together form a grammar of survival. A senior groom named Hugh had explained it to him once with the directness of someone who had long ago made peace with the shape of his world. Hugh had said, "There are those who are seen and those who make the seeing possible. Learn which one you are. Do not confuse the two." Thomas had thought about this for many weeks afterward. He was still thinking about it in the moments between tasks, when thinking was briefly possible. He did not fully understand it yet. He understood it with his body. He understood it in the way he pressed himself against the wall when the steward walked past, in the way he kept his eyes slightly down, focused on the middle distance, present but not demanding presence. This was the grammar he lived inside. Not cruel, exactly, not kind, simply a structure so old and so complete that questioning it would have felt like questioning the arrangement of the stones. The stones, after all, had been there much longer than Thomas, and they intended to remain. A medieval castle was, among other things, a machine for managing cold. Every architectural decision, the thickness of the walls, the placement of the great hall, the deep-set windows with their heavy wooden shutters, was made in negotiation with the cold, which was not seasonal here but permanent, a resident as fixed as any lord or servant. The cold lived in the corridors. It lived in the stairwells, which acted as chimneys for it in reverse, drawing it upward from the earth and distributing it through the building with democratic thoroughness. It lived in the chapel, in the storage rooms, in the long gallery where the Lord sometimes walked in the afternoon. It was never entirely gone, not even in summer. The stone remembered winter, even when the sky had forgotten it. The fires were the answer, not a perfect answer. Nothing about medieval castle life was perfect, but the answer that existed, the one that had to be maintained with the vigilance you would give to something alive, because in a sense they were. A fire in a great hall hearth was not merely warmth. It was a symbol, a performance, a statement about the vitality and prosperity of the household. A cold hearth was an embarrassment. A dark hearth was almost a scandal. The fires were never allowed to go out. This was Thomas's second task of the morning, and in some ways his most important. He carried the ash bucket first, the remains of last night's fire, grey and still faintly warm, scooped out with the iron shovel and taken to the ash pile in the outer yard where it would eventually be used in the making of lye for washing. This was not glamorous work. The ash rose in small clouds with every scoop settling on his face, in his hair, in the creases of his hands. He did not mind it anymore. You stop minding the things that happen every day. That is both a mercy and a warning. Then the rebuilding. The careful arrangement of the larger logs at the back, the kindling placed with attention in the front, the small curls of bark that would catch first and feed the flame upward into the wood. Thomas had become, without intending to, something of an artist at this. He had a sense for it, for the precise angle of the kindling, the particular gap between the logs that allowed the air to move the way fire needed air to move. Gerald had noticed this once and said nothing, which in Gerald's language of minimal expression was something close to praise. There were 11 hearths in the castle that required tending before the household woke. 11 hearths and Thomas alone, and the darkness still thick in every room. He moved through the castle like a ghost, with a purpose. Through the great hall, through the lesser hall where visiting knights sometimes slept, through the corridor that led to the steward's chamber, bending at each cold hearth, kneeling on the stone, his breath visible in the air before him, building warmth for rooms that were still empty, for people who were still sleeping, for people who were still sleeping, for a world that would wake. And walk through these rooms and feel the heat, and not once, not even once, think of who had made it. This did not make Thomas sad. It was simply true, and truth, in his experience, was easier to carry when you stopped arguing with its weight. By the time Thomas arrived in the kitchen for his third rotation of the morning, the room was already operating at a pitch that in any other context would have suggested something had gone terribly wrong. Steam was rising from 3 iron pots at once. 2 boys were turning a spit over the central fire with the mechanical resignation of people who had accepted that their entire existence at this particular moment was rotational. Marta was at the central table, her back to the door, doing something to a joint of meat, with the kind of focused aggression that made the space around her feel deliberately uninhabited. The smell was extraordinary. Not extraordinary in the way that is easy to describe. Not pleasant, not unpleasant, but overwhelming in the way that total immersion in any single sensory experience becomes overwhelming. Wood smoke, and rendered fat, and the iron smell of blood, and somewhere beneath it all the yeasty warmth of bread that had been baking since before most of the castle had opened its eyes. The heat pushed against you at the door like a physical presence. After the cold of the corridors, it was almost violent in its welcome. A castle kitchen feeding a lord's household and its guests was not cooking in any sense that the word carries today. It was logistics, it was theatre, it was controlled emergency. The number of dishes expected at a single meal for a lord of even modest importance was staggering, not because anyone was intended to eat everything, but because abundance was itself the message. The table had to demonstrate prosperity. It had to announce, through sheer material volume, that this was a house ho, where scarcity did not apply. Every dish was an argument. Every sauce was a sentence in a language that said, "We are powerful here. The servants who made this happen ate last, ate less, and ate in a different room." Thomas's tasks in the kitchen were the ones that required the least skill and the most endurance. He fetched and carried. He plunged his arms into cold water to scrub the implements that Marta required, clean with an urgency that implied the fate of kingdoms rested on the clarity of a particular ladle. He swept the floor, which required constant attention because the floor of a medieval kitchen was a dynamic landscape. Bones, vegetable trimmings, spilled fat, ash from the fire, the wet prints of boots that had walked through all of the above. A boy named Edmund, perhaps a year older than Thomas, worked beside him at the washing. Edmund had a way of narrating everything he did in a low, continuous murmur, not to Thomas specifically, but to the air around him, a running commentary that served no communicative purpose, but seemed to keep him anchored to himself. Pot, pot again. This pot has something in it that was not food when it was put in and is not food now. Another pot. Thomas found this deeply comforting in a way he could not have explained. Above them, the great meal assembled itself dish by dish, course by imagined course, while the fire roared and the steam rose and the morning outside made its slow, indifferent way toward noon. The great hall at mealtimes was a different country entirely from the hall that Thomas moved through in the early morning dark. In the morning, it was cavernous and cold and slightly melancholy, the long trestle tables folded against the walls, the rushes on the floor, still holding the smells of yesterday's meal. By the time the household assembled to eat, it had been transformed. the tables set out and covered in white linen there. One of the laundry servants had spent the better part of the morning pressing with heated stones, the candles lit in the iron chandelier above, the benches arranged with the careful attention to social geometry that characterized every aspect of castle life. The lord sat at the high table on the raised dais at the far end. His immediate household, his wife, his senior household officers, any guests of sufficient importance, sat with him or near him in an arrangement that was readable, like a sentence by anyone who understood the grammar. The further from the high table you sat, the lower your degree. This was not subtle. It was not meant to be subtle. The entire architecture of the medieval meal was a diagram of power, and everyone in the room was simultaneously a reader and a word within it. The servants who brought the food did not exist within this diagram. They existed beside it, passing through it, serving it, but they were not part of it in any way that the diagram acknowledged. This was the art of serving at table, to be present without being there. To move through a room full of people as though you were made of something slightly less substantial than the air. Take a slow breath now, because this part asks something quiet of you. Thomas had learned to cultivate a particular quality of attention during the meal service, a wide, soft awareness that tracked everything without focusing on anything. He knew where every cup was in relation to how full it was. He knew the particular angle of the Lord's head that preceded a desire for more wine, and he had trained himself to be moving toward the pitcher before the angle fully committed itself to a gesture. This was considered good service. It was also in ways that Thomas would never have had words to articulate, a kind of disappearance of the self. A senior serving man named Robert had told him once that the mark of a truly excellent servant was that no guest should be able to recall, at the end of a meal, having seen them. They should remember only that things had appeared when needed, that comfort had been continuous, that they had wanted for nothing and had not had to ask. Thomas was becoming very good at not being remembered. He poured wine into a cup, and the conversation above him continued without a pause, without a glance, without any acknowledgement that a hand had reached into the space between these people and done something careful and necessary. The wine was dark, and the candles were warm, and the Lord laughed at something. Thomas did not hear because he had already moved away, already dissolved back into the periphery, already become once again the furniture that made the room work. There was a man in the castle whose specific role, as far as Thomas had ever been able to determine, was to know things. His name was William, and he held the title of under-steward, which in practice meant that he managed the layer of the household that the steward himself was too important to oversee directly. William was perhaps 40 years old, thin in the way of someone who forgot to eat because eating was not interesting to him, with the pale, careful eyes of a person for whom every room was a ledger and every person in it was an entry. William knew that Thomas had spilled a small amount of the morning's ash on the corridor floor near the eastern stairwell 3 days ago, and had attempted to kick it toward the wall rather than sweep it properly. Thomas had told no one. There had been no one present. And yet William had mentioned it, not with anger, not even with particular emphasis, but in the way you might note that a door was left slightly ajar as information, filed and retrievable. This was the thing about castle life that no amount of instruction could fully prepare you for, the pervasive architectural quality of surveillance. It was not the surveillance of a watchman at a gate, visible and purposeful. It was something more ambient than that, something built into the social fabric of a space where dozens of people lived and worked in close proximity, and every hierarchy depended on the continuous monitoring of those below it. People watched because watching was how you maintained position. People reported because information was currency, and people in positions like William's had spent decades developing the particular skill of knowing without being seen to look. The effect on a person like Thomas was specific and subtle. You did not become paranoid. Exactly. Paranoia suggests a fear that exceeds the actual threat, and in a castle, the threat was real. What you became instead was continuously self-aware, continuously performing for an audience you could not locate, but whose presence you could feel the way you feel a change in air pressure before rain. You became the watcher of yourself. Was the bucket carried at the correct angle? Were the eyes properly lowered when passing the steward's door? Was the pace of movement appropriate, quick enough to signal diligence, not so quick as to suggest carelessness? These calculations happened constantly, in the background of every task, running alongside the actual work like a second occupation. Edmund, who had a philosopher's relationship with discomfort, had once said to Thomas very quietly while they were both scrubbing the kitchen floor, "I think the watching is the point, not what they find. The watching itself is how they remind you of what you are." Thomas had gone very still when Edmund said this. He had not responded. There was nothing safe to say in response to something so precisely correct. He picked up his bucket. He walked down the corridor. He kept his eyes at the middle distance. And where in the castle, in a room Thomas could not see, William turned a page in the ledger of his attention, and the entry for Thomas remained, as it always remained, carefully open. It was a cup. An ordinary cup, ceramic, slightly chipped already at the rim. One of perhaps 30 such cups in the kitchen inventory. Thomas had been carrying 6 of them stacked in his arms, which was 2 more than was wise. More than was wise, because the afternoon was moving fast, and the table needed to be set before the steward made his inspection round. And the inspection was the kind of event that reorganized everything else in the day around itself, like furniture moved to make space for something large. He had taken the corner too quickly. The bottom cup caught the edge of the door frame, a sound so small, a contact so brief, that it barely qualified as an event. And then the cup was on the floor, and it was in pieces, and the 5 remaining cups were still in his arms. And Thomas was standing very still in the corridor, with the particular quality of stillness that belongs to someone who already knows what has happened before their mind has finished processing it. The cup would need to be reported. This was not optional. The inventory of the household was maintained with a precision that would have impressed people of any century, and a missing cup was a discrepancy, and discrepancies were questions that demanded answers. And the answer to this question had Thomas's name already attached to it. He reported it to Gerald. Gerald looked at the pieces of ceramic that Thomas had carried back in his hands. He had thought, for a confused moment, that perhaps returning the pieces demonstrated a kind of conscientiousness that might matter, and said nothing for long enough, but the silence itself communicated something complete. Then Gerald told him he would stand before the steward before the evening meal. Ward's name was Henry, and Henry was not a cruel man. This is important to understand because what happened next was not cruelty. It was administration. Henry sat at his small table in his chamber and looked at Thomas with the expression of someone who has had a very long day and who views this particular conversation as an item in a list rather than a human encounter, and he told Thomas that the cost of the cup would be deducted from his wage, which was very small, over the next 3 months. He also told Thomas that he would perform the additional task of cleaning the great hall fireplace each morning for 1 month, which was the worst of the fireplace tasks, the one that left you grey with ash to your elbows and sometimes your shoulders. Then Henry made a note in his ledger and returned to the papers on his desk, and Thomas understood with the clean clarity of a very cold morning that he had been dismissed. He walked out of the chamber and stood in the corridor and did not move for a moment. He thought about the cup. He thought about the corner. He thought about the 2 extra cups he had added to the stack because the afternoon was moving fast. He thought about Edmund's quiet running commentary over the washing basin, the way it had made the morning feel survivable. He picked up his things and went back to work. The castle did not pause for the weight of small disasters. Nothing here waited for you to be ready. You simply continued, and the continuing was the whole of it. There is a kind of tiredness that is not dramatic. It does not arrive with collapse or crisis. It does not announce itself. It simply accumulates the way sediment accumulates at the bottom of a slow river, layer by layer, day by day, until the river is measurably shallower than it once was, and you only notice if you have been watching long enough to compare. By the middle of the afternoon, though, Maz's body was a record of the day's events written in sensation. The palms of his hands held the memory of the bucket rope, 2 raised lines familiar as signatures. His knees remembered the stone of 11 hearths. His shoulders carried the arithmetic of every loaded tray, every full bucket, every armful of wood. His lower back, which had begun making a specific complaint perhaps 2 months ago, was now making it continuously, a low and persistent notation in a language of ache that he had learned to translate into something that meant keep going. This was not exceptional. Every servant in the castle carried this same text in their body. The older ones carried a longer version, men and women in their 30s and 40s who moved through the castle with the careful deliberateness of someone who has learned, from many years of negotiation with pain, exactly distribute the weight of a task across the parts of the body that still cooperated freely. An older kitchen woman named Agnes had a quality of movement that Thomas had studied, almost without meaning to, the way you study the movement of water to understand the shape of the land beneath it. She never wasted emotion. She never carried more than was precisely necessary. She had, over the course of decades, refined the art of physical labor into something very close to efficiency, which was itself a form of survival. Thomas was learning this, though he did not yet have the years to have mastered it. He was still in the stage where the body protested. Later, if later came, the protest would quiet into something steadier, something that was still suffering but had made its accommodation with the fact of suffering, and found a way to exist alongside it without continuous commentary. Close your eyes for just a moment if you like. Feel where your own body is resting right now. Feel the difference between where and where Thomas is. He carried a load of firewood from the outer yard to the wood store adjacent to the kitchen. Then he returned to the yard. Then he carried another load. Then he carried another load. The wood was cut from the forest beyond the outer walls, split and stacked by men whose entire working lives existed in the space between the axe and the pile, and it arrived in the castle in quantities that seemed enormous until you understood how much fire a castle required to sustain itself through a single day. The afternoon light was the colour of old brass when Thomas finished the wood. He stood in the yard for a moment with his hands on his knees, not quite doubled over, but close, breathing. The castle walls rose on 3 sides of him, enormous and indifferent, catching the light on their upper edges while the yard below remained in the early shadow of a day, beginning its long descent. He was 13 years old. He had been awake for 11 hours. The evening had not yet begun. It came so rarely and so briefly that some evenings Thomas was not sure it had come at all. That narrow, improbable window between the end of the day's final tasks and the beginning of the preparations for tomorrow, when the castle settled into something that was not quite silence but was close enough to it that the difference no longer mattered. The lord had retired, the great hall had been cleared, the trestles folded back against the walls, the linen removed and taken for washing, the candles extinguished, except for the 2 kept burning near the door. The kitchen had been scoured, a word that does not begin to convey the sustained physical effort involved, and Marta had gone to wherever Marta went, which was a question no one had ever successfully answered. Gerald had made his final round, his eyebrows performing their last audit of the day. The castle had reached the particular stillness of a place that has been and completely used and now exists in the pause before being used again. In this pause, Thomas sat. He sat on the low stone bench near the inner courtyard door, with Edmund beside him and two other kitchen boys whose names were Will and a boy everyone called Sparrow because of the way he moved, quick and slightly sideways. They had bread from the kitchen end pieces, the parts that had not made it to the Lord's table, which were still bread, still warm from the afternoon's baking, and which, in the particular hunger of that hour, tasted like something much more significant than bread. They did not talk much. This was the remarkable thing about this hour, not that it was silent, but that the silence was chosen. During every other part of the day, silence was imposed, enforced, observed out of necessity and deference. Here, in this thin slice of evening, they could have talked, and no one would have objected, but mostly they didn't. Mostly they sat and chewed their bread and looked at the small square of sky visible above the courtyard walls, which was moving through shades of purple and deep blue that, in this context, felt like a kind of luxury. Edmund was humming something. Not a song Thomas could identify, perhaps not a real song at all, perhaps just a sound that Edmund's body made when it was finally allowed to stop serving another function. Sparrow was asleep, sitting up, his head against the wall, his mouth slightly open, his bread still held loosely in one hand. He would not fall, he had perfected this particular skill. Thomas looked at the sky. He thought about nothing specific, which was itself a form of rest so profound that it bordered on pleasure. The ache in his back was still present. It would not be absent for a long time, if ever, but in this hour it was simply a fact rather than a demand. He could feel it without being required to respond to it. This was the whole of it. Bread and the sky and the brief company of people who understood, without words, everything that the day had been. The bell in the chapel tower rang once, softly, for the hour, and the hour, hearing itself named, began very quietly to end. You might think, lying here now in whatever warmth you have arranged around yourself, that the hardest part of Thomas's life was the cold, or the labour, or the cup, and the ledger, and Henry's patient, administrative indifference. You might think it was the ash that settled in his hair and did not entirely wash out, or the rope handles of the buckets, or the 11 hearths before the sun rose, or the afternoons that extended beyond what any body should reasonably be asked to sustain. But the hardest part was simpler than any of those things. The hardest part was that it would all begin again tomorrow, not as punishment, not as cruelty, just as the nature of it, the relentless, cyclical, deeply impersonal fact of a life structured by service, in which each day was not a progression toward anything but a repetition of itself, varying only in its small disasters and its smaller mercies. Thomas would wake before the bell. He would feel the cold of the stone. He would carry the water, and tend the fires, and carry more water, and tend the fires, and carry more water, and be present without being present, and do the things that kept the castle warm, and fed, and lit, and functioning. And at the end of it he would sit with Edmund and Will, and Sparrow, and eat the bread that was not good enough for the table he served, and watch the sky change colour above the courtyard walls, and then he would sleep, and then he would wake. And the castle would still be there, enormous and cold and permanent, having outlasted every servant who ever passed through it, and prepared to outlast every servant who ever would. There is something in this that is not only sadness. It asks something of you to see it clearly, because it is too easy to feel only the weight of it. The smallness of one life inside a structure so much larger than any life. But consider what Thomas had in the architecture of that smallness. Edmund's murmuring over the washing basin, Sparrow asleep with his bread, the particular satisfaction of a fire built well, of a hearth that caught on the first attempt, of a cup of wine delivered before the gesture that requested it was complete. These were not compensations. They were not the silver lining of something dark. They were simply the texture of a human life, any human life, lived inside whatever conditions history had arranged around it. He did not know that we would remember him. He did not know that someone in a future so distant it would have been inconceivable to him would lie in warmth and stillness and think about the particular cold of his floor and the weight of his bucket and the way the courtyard sky looked at the end of a day that had asked everything of him. He only knew that the darkness outside was beginning, almost imperceptibly, to soften. He pulled his thin blanket to his chin. He closed his eyes. The castle breathed around him, deep and slow, the breath of stones that had been cold for centuries and would be cold for centuries more. And somewhere across the unimaginable distance of all that time, in the quiet of wherever you are right now, you breathed with him.